There are certain mistakes that are commonly made in the geography exam as well as in formal assessments, and we need to make sure as teachers that we are aware of these common mistakes and that we guide the learners suitably so they preferably don't make these mistakes. The first common mistake is that learners don't demonstrate a level of understanding. So learners struggle because they don't read the question correctly. They also often don't identify what sort of question is required. When they do answer, they don't answer on the correct cognitive level and often tend to regurgitate facts. Let's have a look at an example. In this particular example, learners failed to give the measures to reduce the climate change and tend to just give the causes. In the next example, learners tended to list causes of drought and not the impact as the question actually asked. And in the third question, or the third example, learners struggle to identify what the question actually is asking, and they tend to refer to the solutions in rural areas to prevent rural-urban migration instead of providing solutions for urban blight. Now, how can we help the learners? Well, we need to emphasize the importance of both factual knowledge and the application of this knowledge to scenarios and examples. We need to discourage learners from regurgitating the facts, and we need to expose the learners to a variety of different questions in class on a daily basis and coach them on how to approach different questions. Most importantly, we need to provide learners with a list of key words and explain to them what these words mean. For example, when it says distinguish or justify or outline or suggest, that they actually answer the question at the correct cognitive level. Now, the next common mistake is that learners aren't familiar with different maps and diagrams. And since this forms a fundamental part of geography, it's essential that we see where learners struggle with this and help them to overcome it. Often learners don't have enough time in class to work on maps and diagrams and work with them. They often struggle to identify key features on the maps, and they fail to use their theoretical knowledge to answer map work questions. Learners often tend to answer questions based on personal experience and not from using the map or photographic evidence. Let's have a look at some examples. The first example, in this case, learners weren't familiar with the steps or processes for this, and they weren't able to retrieve the information from the orthophoto map and transfer and plot information in a cross-section on a graph. The next one is that learners were unfamiliar with applying theoretical knowledge to find evidence on the topographical map. The third question, or the third example, the learners struggled to identify the clues or evidence to support the statement. And all of these examples show that the learners need practice in this. They need guidance and practice. So how do we do this? How do we help our learners? Well, the first is continuous integration of content knowledge with map work is essential, linking the theory and the practical together. Teachers should teach calculations and how to interpret their answers. Learners need to constantly practice their calculations. And then give a lot of exercise to identify landforms and drainage patterns on maps. Practice and practice and practice. The third common mistake is that learners aren't able to calculate, and this often goes through many subjects. Often learners aren't familiar with general formulae and calculations, and they're not able to apply the correct formulae or apply the learned formulae in the actual question. Now here's one example. In this particular example, learners were not able to calculate the magnetic declination. They were either not familiar with the formula or couldn't select the correct information to insert into the formula. And this happens often in the exam papers. So how do we help the learners? What can we do? Well, the first is to make sure they're actually familiar with all the formulae that they need to have, by possibly giving them a list of all the formulae and letting them practice and apply the formula over and over again to different situations and appropriate situations. Also, it's important to emphasize the importance of becoming familiar with the different procedures and different steps of the calculations. And most importantly, emphasize that the marks that they would lose unnecessarily if they weren't confident with the formulae and calculations. The fourth common mistake is that learners aren't able to distinguish between content. Often learners give irrelevant content to an answer, or they confuse concepts and terminology. Let's have a look at some examples here. In this particular example, often learners have answered the question that followed reasonably well. However, the learners interchange the terms climate or global warming when they're answering the question. The next question also showed that learners had a lack of understanding of the structural landscapes associated with horizontal underlying rock strata. In this question, many learners failed to even define the term globalization, and then they weren't able to answer any of the follow-up questions relating to globalization. Now, how do we help the learners? What can we do? Well, the first is to emphasize the importance of understanding the facts and not just learning them off by heart. We need to make sure that the learners understand the importance of reading, and in particular, reading the question carefully. Always provide suitable examples in class of difficult concepts so the learners are easily able to distinguish between the terminology used and that they get practice in answering questions. And most importantly, support the learners in identifying the appropriate factual information to support their answer. These 4 common mistakes appear time and time again, and learners tend to make them all the time. So we need to make sure as teachers that we guide the learners on how to improve their results by making sure they don't make these common mistakes.